The first day, Lieutenant Jordan Matthews adjusted the rearview mirror in her unmarked police car as she glanced at the pristine streets of West Haven. The neighborhood was immaculate, a picturesque suburb of towering homes with manicured lawns, luxury cars gleaming in the driveways, and a tranquility that felt staged. Yet underneath the calm, Jordan could sense something else, a tension she couldn't quite place. Today marked her first day in this new precinct, and though she'd worked tirelessly to earn this promotion, stepping into a predominantly white, affluent area as a black female lieutenant carried its own unique challenges. Jordan had built her career in a gritty downtown precinct, known for its high crime rates and unrelenting pace. There, she had earned a reputation as a relentless officer who didn't hesitate to challenge protocols if it meant delivering justice. That reputation, however, was a double-edged sword, one that garnered both respect and resistance depending on who you asked. Now, in the quiet opulence of West Haven, Jordan was entering a different battlefield. This wasn't about gang activity or drug raids. This was about culture, perception, and the delicate politics of leadership in a precinct where tradition reigned supreme. She adjusted the gold badge pinned to her crisp navy uniform, feeling its weight both physically and metaphorically. It wasn't just a symbol of her authority. It was a reminder of the battles she'd fought to wear it. Jordan had weathered subtle slights, outright dismissals, and constant questioning of her qualifications. Each step of her journey had required her to be twice as prepared, twice as composed, and twice as resilient. As she pulled into the precinct parking lot, her unmarked vehicle drew immediate attention. A group of officers loitering near the entrance turned their heads, their casual conversation halting mid-sentence. Jordan wasn't surprised by the sudden silence. She had long since grown used to these moments. The officers' expressions were a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Some openly stared, their gazes questioning. Others tried to act disinterested, but failed to hide the sideways glances. Jordan straightened her back, smoothed her uniform, and stepped out of the car with purpose. She took her time, locking the door and surveying the precinct's facade, a modern building with glass panel doors and sleek lettering that seemed almost sterile compared to the gritty station she'd come from. The lingering silence from the officers hung in the air, but Jordan didn't falter. She squared her shoulders, exuding quiet confidence, and walked toward the building. Inside, the precinct gleamed with polished floors, pristine desks, and state-of-the-art technology. Jordan approached the front desk, where a young officer barely glanced up before doing a double-take. His surprise was evident, and Jordan knew exactly what he was thinking. "She's not what I expected." "Lieutenant Jordan Matthews," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the awkward pause. "Here to see Captain Rogers." The officer blinked, clearly flustered, before fumbling for the phone. "One moment, Mom," he muttered, his eyes flickering between her badge and her face. Minutes later, Captain Samuel Rogers appeared. A tall, middle-aged man with sharp features and a stiff posture, Rogers exuded an air of authority tinged with caution. His handshake was polite but lacked warmth. "Lieutenant Matthews," he greeted, his tone formal. "Welcome to West Haven. Let's talk." Jordan followed him to his office, acutely aware of the gazes following her as they walked through the precinct. The hushed murmurs and sideways glances were impossible to miss. Once inside the captain's office, Rogers gestured for her to sit. His desk was meticulously organized, and a framed photo of his family sat prominently beside a stack of files. He settled into his chair, his expression shifting from professional to guarded. "I'll be honest with you, Lieutenant," Rogers began, leaning back slightly. "This precinct has a culture. It's established, and for the most part, it works. Change isn't something my team takes too easily." Jordan met his gaze, her expression calm but unwavering. "Understood, Captain. I'm here to lead with integrity and ensure this precinct operates at its best. Respecting the culture doesn't mean overlooking issues that need addressing." Rogers' lips tightened, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "Some of my officers have expressed concerns about your appointment," he admitted. "Your reputation precedes you, and not everyone here is thrilled about your approach to challenging norms." Jordan's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. "With all due respect, Captain, I'm not here to please everyone. I'm here to ensure justice and uphold the values this badge represents." Rogers studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Fair enough," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But you'll need to tread carefully. This is a precinct where respect has to be earned. Change too much too quickly, and you'll face resistance." Jordan leaned forward, her voice steady. "I'm not here to disrupt for the sake of disruption. I'm here to lead, and I'm prepared to earn that respect." Rogers seemed to accept her words, though the tension in the room remained palpable. He stood and extended a hand. "Welcome aboard, Lieutenant. You've got a tough road ahead, but I hope you're ready for it." The rest of the morning was a blur of introductions and observations. Rogers assigned Sergeant Ben Taylor, a seasoned officer in his mid-50s, to show Jordan around. Taylor was cordial but cautious, his demeanor suggesting he was reserving judgment. As they walked through the precinct, Jordan took note of the varying reactions from the officers they passed. Some offered polite nods, others barely acknowledged her presence. One officer, however, stood out. By the entrance, a young officer leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, and his posture radiating defiance. His name tag read Blake Carter, and his gaze was piercing, filled with a mix of suspicion and resentment. Taylor noticed her lingering gaze and leaned in slightly. "Carter's opinionated," he said carefully. "He doesn't take well to new faces, especially those he thinks will shake things up." Jordan gave a small nod, mentally filing the information away. She'd dealt with officers like Carter before, those who saw new leadership as a threat to their status quo. It wasn't new, but it was always a challenge. Later that afternoon, as Jordan returned to her car to grab some paperwork, she noticed Carter lingering nearby. His posture was tense, his eyes sharp as they followed her movements. "Lieutenant," he called out, his tone laced with condescension. "Mind if I see some ID?" Jordan stopped, her expression calm despite the disrespect in his voice. "Officer Carter, I'm your new commanding officer. My ID is my badge." Carter sneered, crossing his arms. "Driving an unmarked car, huh? You look a little out of place. We've had issues with stolen vehicles around here. Just doing my due diligence." Jordan's patience was tested, but she kept her tone even. "Here's my badge," she said, holding it up for him to see. "If you have concerns, feel free to take them up with Captain Rogers." But Carter's tone grew more confrontational. "I don't care what your badge says. I'm giving you a direct order to step out of the car." A small crowd of officers had started to gather, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Jordan could feel the weight of their gazes, the silent judgment in their eyes. She took a steadying breath, her voice firm but calm. "I'm not stepping out of the car without a valid reason, Officer Carter. I've shown you my identification. If you need further verification, I suggest you contact Captain Rogers." Carter's face twisted with anger, his hand inching toward his holster. The tension crackled in the air like static electricity, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. Jordan stood her ground, her heart pounding but her composure unshaken. She knew this moment would define not just her first day, but her entire tenure in this precinct, and she refused to back down. Tensions rising. The tension in the air outside the precinct was palpable. Lieutenant Jordan Matthews remained composed, her steady gaze locked onto Officer Blake Carter, who now stood mere feet away with his hand hovering near his holster. The group of onlookers, officers from the precinct, watched in stunned silence, their curiosity quickly morphing into disbelief and unease. The quiet murmurs from the gathered officers were enough to tell Jordan that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a test. Jordan exhaled slowly, her mind working through the options. If she escalated, she'd play right into Carter's hands. If she backed down, she'd risk losing the respect of not only him, but everyone who stood watching. This was a delicate moment, one that demanded precision, control, and unshakable resolve. "Officer Carter," she said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that demanded attention, "you're out of line." Carter sneered, his defiance unrelenting. "Out of line," he repeated mockingly. "You're the one refusing a lawful request, Lieutenant, or whoever you are. Around here, everyone gets checked out, even if they flash a badge." Jordan's grip on her professionalism remained ironclad. "This isn't about protocol, and we both know it," she replied evenly. "I've shown you my badge. I'm your commanding officer. This is not the way we do things, not here, not anywhere." Her words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. The officers nearby exchanged nervous glances, some shifting uncomfortably, while others remained rooted in place, watching the standoff unfold. It was clear that Carter had overstepped, but no one dared intervene. The silence was deafening. "You think that badge means you can just show up here and start changing things?" Carter continued, his tone dripping with disdain. "This precinct doesn't need someone like you coming in and throwing their weight around." Jordan felt the heat of his words, but she refused to rise to the bait. Instead, she took a step closer, her eyes unwavering. "This isn't about what you think this precinct needs, Carter. It's about respect. For the badge, for the law, and for the team you claim to be a part of." Carter's jaw tightened, his posture stiffening. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually draw his weapon. The crowd around them grew visibly tense, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. Then, just as suddenly as the standoff had begun, a voice cut through the tension. "Carter, stand down." All eyes turned as Captain Rogers strode onto the scene, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. His commanding presence parted the crowd like a knife, and Carter hesitated, his bravado faltering. "Captain," Carter started, his tone defensive, "I was just—" "Enough," Rogers interrupted, his voice cold and sharp. "Lieutenant Matthews has shown her badge and identified herself. You're out of line, and you know it. Stand down immediately." Carter hesitated, his defiance flickering for a moment before he reluctantly stepped back, lowering his hand from his holster. His glare lingered on Jordan, but he said nothing more. Rogers turned to Jordan, his expression softening slightly. "Lieutenant, are you all right?" Jordan nodded, her posture still rigid but her voice calm. "I'm fine, Captain. Thank you." Rogers scanned the gathered officers, his eyes narrowing. "This is not the kind of behavior I expect from my team," he said sternly. "Everyone here knows better." Dismissed. The crowd began to disperse, the officers muttering amongst themselves as they returned to their duties. Carter lingered for a moment, his jaw clenched, before finally turning and walking away without another word. The tension lingered in the air long after he was gone. Rogers gestured for Jordan to follow him inside. Once they were in his office, he closed the door and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," he said, his tone more measured now. "Carter's a good officer, but he's got a chip on his shoulder. He doesn't take well to change." Jordan met his gaze, her voice steady. "With all due respect, Captain, this wasn't just resistance to change. That was disrespect, plain and simple. And it wasn't just Carter. Did you see the way the others stood by and watched?" Rogers sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "This precinct, it's a tight-knit group. They're used to their way of doing things, and when someone new comes in, especially someone with your background, it's going to take time for them to adjust." Jordan stiffened slightly. "My background," she repeated, her voice calm but pointed. Rogers hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "You're coming from a different environment, high-stakes precincts, diverse teams, a reputation for challenging the status quo. That's not what they're used to here." "And that's exactly why I'm here," Jordan replied, her tone unwavering. "This isn't just about me fitting in. It's about this precinct meeting the standards of integrity and professionalism that come with wearing this badge. If that means addressing a toxic culture, then so be it." Rogers studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. "But you'll need to pick your battles carefully. Carter's outburst was unacceptable, and I'll address it. But if you push too hard, too fast, you'll risk alienating the team entirely." Jordan leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but not confrontational. "Captain, I don't intend to push anyone, but I won't tolerate open defiance or disrespect. This isn't just about me. It's about the message it sends to the rest of the precinct." Rogers nodded again, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "I'll back you up, Lieutenant. Just tread carefully." The meeting ended on a cautious note, and Jordan returned to her office with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. Carter's actions were a symptom of a larger issue, one that would take time, patience, and unwavering resolve to address. Later that evening, as Jordan sat at her desk reviewing the precinct's case files, a knock at her door interrupted her focus. She looked up to see Sergeant Ben Taylor standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. Jordan gestured for him to take a seat. "What's on your mind, Sergeant?" Taylor hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I heard about what happened with Carter earlier. Just wanted to say, not everyone here feels the way he does." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "I appreciate that, Sergeant, but it's not just about Carter. There's a culture here that needs to change." Taylor nodded slowly. "You're not wrong. This precinct, it's been a certain way for a long time. And some of us have been waiting for someone to come in and shake things up." Jordan studied him for a moment, her curiosity piqued. "And you think I'm that someone?" Taylor smiled faintly. "Let's just say I'm willing to give you a chance, but you've got your work cut out for you." Jordan leaned back in her chair, her determination unwavering. "I've never been afraid of hard work, Sergeant, and I'm not about to start now." As Taylor left her office, Jordan felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be challenging, but she wasn't alone. And that, she knew, was the first step toward making real change. Unseen currents. The next morning, Lieutenant Jordan Matthews arrived at the precinct earlier than usual, her mind still replaying the events of the previous day. Carter's brazen defiance, the tense standoff, and the silent judgment of the onlookers. It all lingered like a shadow over her thoughts. She knew moments like these could define leadership. Her ability to navigate them would either bolster her standing or reinforce the doubts some already harbored. Jordan parked her unmarked car in the lot, her movements deliberate. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over West Haven. The early hour meant the precinct was quieter than usual, and she appreciated the chance to settle in before the day's chaos began. As she entered the precinct, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, she noticed a few officers already at their desks. Some looked up briefly, offering polite nods, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Jordan didn't take it personally. She understood that respect wasn't given freely in environments like this. It had to be earned. Inside her office, Jordan set down her coffee and opened the precinct's current case files. West Haven wasn't a high-crime area, but it wasn't without its challenges. The cases reflected a different kind of complexity: white-collar crimes, domestic disputes, and a troubling rise in implicit bias complaints against the department itself. The latter was a particularly sensitive issue, and Jordan knew it wouldn't be addressed without pushback. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Looking up, she saw Sergeant Ben Taylor standing in the doorway, a stack of papers in his hands. "Morning, Lieutenant," he greeted, his tone polite but cautious. "Morning, Sergeant," Jordan replied, gesturing for him to enter. "What's on your mind?" Taylor stepped inside, setting the papers on her desk. "These are last month's incident reports and patrol logs. Captain Rogers thought you'd want to review them." Jordan nodded, glancing at the neatly organized stack. "Thank you. Anything I should know before diving in?" Taylor hesitated, his expression shifting slightly. "There's something you should be aware of. It's about Carter." Jordan folded her hands on the desk, her interest piqued. "Go on." Taylor sighed, pulling a chair closer and sitting down. Carter's been here for about 5 years. He's got a solid record on paper, good arrest numbers, few complaints. But he's one of those officers who's resistant to authority, especially when it comes from someone he doesn't think belongs. Jordan raised an eyebrow. Doesn't think belongs. You mean someone like me? Taylor didn't flinch, though his tone softened. Yes, to put it bluntly, Carter's never worked under someone like you. A black woman, someone from a high-stakes precinct, someone who challenges the status quo. It doesn't excuse his behavior, but it does explain some of it. Jordan appreciated Taylor's candor, even if it didn't surprise her. And what about the rest of the team? Are they following his lead? Taylor shook his head. Not all of them. Some are just cautious. They've been here a long time, and they're used to things being a certain way. Carter's the loudest voice, but he doesn't represent everyone. Jordan leaned back in her chair, processing his words. Thank you for telling me this, Sergeant. It helps to know what I'm walking into. Taylor nodded, standing to leave. If you need anything, Lieutenant, I'm here. As Taylor left the office, Jordan's gaze shifted back to the stack of reports. She began flipping through the patrol logs, her sharp eye scanning for patterns. One entry caught her attention. A routine patrol logged by Carter just 2 days prior. The location was a quiet residential street, the report noting nothing unusual. Yet something about it felt off. The time stamp was unusually long for a routine drive-through, and there was no accompanying detail to explain why. Jordan made a note to follow up on it later, filing it away in her growing list of concerns about Carter. By mid-morning, the precinct was buzzing with activity. Officers filed in and out, discussing cases and preparing for the day's assignments. Jordan stepped into the main room, her presence drawing subtle glances from those around her. She ignored them, her focus on a briefing she'd scheduled to discuss updated protocols. As the officers gathered in the briefing room, Jordan stood at the front, her posture confident but approachable. She began outlining the new measures, emphasizing accountability and community engagement, key areas she believed needed improvement. The room was quiet as she spoke, though she could sense the undercurrent of resistance. Carter sat in the back, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Jordan didn't let his presence rattle her, though she made a point to meet his gaze as she spoke. If he wanted a reason to undermine her, she wouldn't give him one. When the briefing ended, most of the officers filed out quickly, but Carter lingered. He approached her with a deliberate slowness, his hands tucked into his pockets. Interesting ideas you've got there, Lieutenant, he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. But let me ask you this, how's any of that supposed to work here? West Haven's not exactly the kind of place where community engagement is a priority. Jordan tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but firm. West Haven is part of the community, Officer Carter, and the people here deserve the same level of accountability and professionalism as anywhere else. Carter smirked, his eyes narrowing. Right. And you think coming in here with your big city ideas is going to change how things work? You've got a lot to learn about this place, Lieutenant. Jordan didn't flinch. And you've got a lot to learn about leadership, Carter. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with accountability. And that includes you. Carter's smirk faltered, though he quickly recovered. We'll see how long that lasts, he muttered before walking away. Jordan watched him leave, her resolve hardening. Carter's resistance was more than a personal vendetta. It was a symptom of a deeper issue within the precinct, and she was determined to address it. That afternoon, Jordan decided to follow up on the patrol log that had caught her attention earlier. She called Officer Blake Carter into her office, the tension palpable as he entered and closed the door behind him. "Take a seat, officer," Jordan said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Carter sat down, his posture defensive. "What's this about, Lieutenant?" Jordan slid the patrol log across the desk, her eyes locked on his. "2 nights ago, you logged a routine patrol on Maplewood Drive. The report says it was uneventful, but the time stamp suggests you spent over 30 minutes in the area. care to explain?" Carter's expression didn't change, though his jaw tightened slightly. "Maplewood's a quiet street. I was making sure everything was in order." "For 30 minutes," Jordan pressed. "That's an unusually long time for a single patrol in a low-crime area." Carter shrugged. "Sometimes I take my time. Don't want to miss anything." Jordan leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Carter, I'm not here to micromanage, but I expect detailed reports. If there's nothing to hide, there shouldn't be any issue with providing a full account of your patrol." Carter's eyes flashed with defiance. "Are you accusing me of something, Lieutenant?" Jordan didn't blink. "I'm asking you to do your job thoroughly and transparently. If there's nothing to hide, then there's nothing to worry about." "Understood." For a moment, Carter didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Finally, he stood, his movements stiff. "Understood," he said curtly before turning and leaving the office. As the door closed behind him, Jordan exhaled slowly. Carter's reaction only deepened her suspicion. Something about his patrol didn't sit right, and she was determined to uncover the truth. The precinct was beginning to show its cracks, and Jordan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But if there was one thing she'd learned in her career, it was that progress required perseverance, and she had plenty of that to give. Cracks in the armor. The precinct buzzed with activity as Lieutenant Jordan Matthews settled into her second full day on the job. The undercurrent of tension from her confrontation with Officer Carter the day prior lingered in the air like a storm cloud. Jordan wasn't naive. She knew that Carter's actions weren't just impulsive. They were indicative of a culture that resisted oversight, accountability, and change. And as she reviewed the details of the precinct's operations, that truth became more evident. She started her morning by delving into the patrol logs from the past month. One of her priorities was identifying patterns, areas where officers' actions didn't align with policy or where behaviors raised red flags. What she found only deepened her concern. Several officers, Carter among them, had inconsistencies in their reports. Timestamps didn't match up, vague language filled their notes, and in some cases, there were entire gaps where activity should have been logged. Jordan sighed, leaning back in her chair. She tapped her pen against her desk, her mind racing. This wasn't just negligence. It felt intentional, almost as if these officers thought no one would ever scrutinize their actions. And maybe, until now, no one had. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She looked up to see Sergeant Ben Taylor standing in the doorway, holding a folder. "Morning, Lieutenant," Taylor said, stepping inside. "Thought you'd want to see this. It's from our community liaison, a summary of complaints from the past 6 months." Jordan accepted the folder with a nod of thanks. As she opened it and began skimming the contents, her stomach tightened. The complaints ranged from excessive force during arrests to allegations of racial profiling. Most were vague, without enough detail to warrant immediate action, but there were a few that stood out. One, in particular, caught her attention. A local black resident had reported being stopped and questioned multiple times on their way to work, always by the same officer. The name attached to the complaint made Jordan's pulse quicken. Officer Blake Carter. She set the file down, her expression hardening. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said. "This confirms some of my concerns." Taylor hesitated, his tone cautious. "Carter's not the only one, Lieutenant. There are a few others who've gotten too comfortable bending the rules. It's been going on for a while. And no one's addressed it." Jordan asked, though she already knew the answer. Taylor shrugged, his expression grim. "Captain Rogers likes to avoid conflict. He's a good leader, but he's not one for shaking things up. And with officers like Carter, it's easier to look the other way." Jordan's jaw tightened. "That's not good enough," she said firmly. "If there's a culture of misconduct here, it's my responsibility to address it, whether people like it or not." Taylor nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "Just be careful. Carter's got friends in this precinct. If you push too hard, you might find yourself outnumbered." Jordan gave him a small, resolute smile. "I've faced worse odds before, Sergeant. Thanks for the heads up." As Taylor left, Jordan leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew she was walking a fine line. Addressing misconduct was necessary, but it also risked alienating officers who might otherwise support her. She needed a strategy, one that would hold people accountable without creating unnecessary division. That afternoon, Jordan decided to make her presence known on the ground. She joined a routine patrol with Officer Maria Lopez, one of the precinct's newer recruits. Lopez was young, eager, and clearly nervous about having the lieutenant ride along. "You don't have to be so formal, Officer Lopez," Jordan said as they drove through the quiet streets of West Haven. "This is just a chance for me to get a feel for how things work around here." Lopez nodded quickly, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Yes, ma'am. I mean, Lieutenant. Sorry." Jordan chuckled softly. "Relax. You're doing fine." As they drove, Jordan observed the neighborhood carefully. West Haven was as pristine as she'd expected. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and a distinct lack of visible crime. But beneath the surface, she could feel the undercurrents of unease. It wasn't just about race or class. It was about power, about who felt entitled to it and who didn't. "Do you like working here?" Jordan asked after a moment. Lopez hesitated, her expression thoughtful. "It's different," she said finally. "It's not what I expected when I joined the force. I thought I'd be helping people, you know. But here, it's more about keeping up appearances." Jordan nodded, her respect for Lopez growing. "Appearances don't keep people safe," she said. "That's why we need to focus on accountability and trust." Lopez glanced at her, a hint of hope in her eyes. "Do you really think things can change?" Jordan's voice was firm. "They have to." As the day wore on, Jordan returned to the precinct to find Captain Rogers waiting for her in her office. His expression was unreadable, but Jordan could sense the tension. "Lieutenant," he began, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." Jordan gestured for him to sit, though she remained standing. "What's on your mind, Captain?" Rogers sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I've been hearing rumblings from the team. Some of the officers aren't happy with how you've come in and started, questioning everything." Jordan's brow furrowed. "I'm not questioning for the sake of questioning, Captain. I'm addressing real issues that have been ignored for too long." "I understand that," Rogers said, his tone measured. "But you need to understand that this precinct operates differently. If you push too hard, you risk losing the trust of the team." Jordan leaned forward, her voice firm but calm. "With all due respect, Captain, trust isn't built by ignoring problems. It's built by addressing them head-on. If some officers are uncomfortable with that, maybe they need to reconsider why they're here." Rogers studied her for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. "You're not wrong," he admitted, "but you've got to pick your battles carefully. Carter, for example, he's a problem, but he's not the only one. If you go after him too hard, his allies will rally around him, and you'll lose your chance to make real change." Jordan nodded, though her resolve didn't waver. "I hear you, Captain, but I won't compromise on integrity. If that means ruffling some feathers, so be it." Rogers stood, his expression resigned but respectful. "Just be careful, Lieutenant. This precinct needs someone like you, but change doesn't happen overnight." As Rogers left, Jordan sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew Rogers was right. Change wouldn't happen overnight. But the cracks in the precinct's armor were already showing, and she intended to expose them fully, no matter the cost. That evening, as Jordan reviewed the day's events, she received an anonymous tip via email. The message was short but chilling. "Check Carter's logs from last week. Something doesn't add up. Follow the money." Jordan's pulse quickened as she stared at the screen. She didn't know who had sent the tip, but it aligned with her suspicions about Carter. She quickly pulled up his patrol logs, cross-referencing them with incident reports and complaint records. What she found made her blood run cold. Carter had been making routine stops at a specific location, a warehouse on the outskirts of town. The logs claimed the stops were part of his regular patrols, but the timing and frequency didn't make sense. And when Jordan cross-checked the warehouse address, she discovered it was linked to a known money laundering operation. Her heart pounded as the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just about Carter's attitude or defiance. This was something much bigger. Jordan closed her laptop, her resolve hardening. If Carter thought he could hide behind the precinct's complacency, he was wrong. She wasn't just here to lead. She was here to uncover the truth. And she wouldn't stop until she did. The tip of the iceberg. Lieutenant Jordan Matthews leaned back in her chair, her mind racing as she reviewed the information on her screen. The anonymous tip had been clear. Check Carter's logs from last week. Something doesn't add up. Follow the money. What she'd found was more than suspicious. It was damning. Officer Blake Carter had logged multiple stops at a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a location tied to a dormant investigation into money laundering. The frequency of the visits, paired with vague reports claiming routine patrol, painted a troubling picture. She glanced at her watch. It was late, and most of the precinct had cleared out, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights creating an eerie calm. But Jordan's mind was anything but calm. She couldn't let this sit until morning. Pulling her phone from her pocket, she dialed Sergeant Ben Taylor. "Taylor," he answered after a couple of rings, his voice groggy. "What's going on, Lieutenant?" "Sorry to bother you this late," Jordan said, her tone apologetic but firm. "I need you to meet me at the precinct. It's important." Taylor didn't hesitate. "Give me 20 minutes. Jordan ended the call and began gathering the evidence she'd compiled. Patrol logs, incident reports, and maps of Carter's routes. She wanted Taylor's perspective before deciding on her next move. If she was going to confront Carter or escalate this to Captain Rogers, she needed to be sure her case was airtight. True to his word, Taylor arrived 20 minutes later, his uniform slightly disheveled, and a coffee cup in hand. He raised an eyebrow as he entered her office, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "This better be good," he said, taking a seat across from her desk. Jordan handed him the printouts, her eyes scanning his face as he flipped through them. "Take a look at Carter's patrol logs from last week," she said. "Pay attention to the stops at this warehouse." Taylor's brow furrowed as he studied the documents. "The old Grayson warehouse," he said, his tone laced with recognition. "I thought that place was shut down years ago. Wasn't there an investigation tied to it?" Jordan nodded. "Money laundering. The investigation stalled out after the business went under, but the connections were never fully severed. What bothers me is how often Carter's been stopping there, and the fact that his reports don't mention anything specific." Taylor set the papers down, his expression grim. "This doesn't look good, Lieutenant. If he's involved in something shady, it could explain a lot about his behavior." Jordan leaned forward, her voice low but resolute. "We need to know for sure. If there's something going on, it's bigger than just Carter's attitude problem. This could be systemic." Taylor rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "What's the plan?" Jordan hesitated for only a moment before replying. "We'll start by checking the warehouse. If Carter's been using it for anything, there might be evidence there. But we need to be careful. If he's working with someone else in the precinct, we can't tip them off." Taylor nodded, his expression serious. "Understood. Let me grab some gear." An hour later, Jordan and Taylor pulled up to the Grayson warehouse, their unmarked car hidden behind a cluster of trees at the edge of the property. The building loomed in the moonlight, its cracked windows and rusted doors giving it an air of abandonment. But as Jordan stepped out of the car, she noticed fresh tire tracks leading up to the side entrance. "Looks like someone's been here recently," Taylor murmured, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. Jordan nodded, her senses on high alert. "Stay sharp." They approached the building cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The door was slightly ajar, and Jordan motioned for Taylor to cover her as she pushed it open. The hinges groaned loudly, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. Inside, the warehouse was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and oil. Stacks of crates lined the walls, their surfaces coated in dust. But as Jordan's flashlight swept across the room, she noticed something that didn't fit: a small table in a corner, its surface cluttered with papers and a laptop. She gestured for Taylor to follow her, her footsteps silent against the concrete floor. When they reached the table, she picked up one of the papers and felt her stomach drop. It was a ledger, filled with names and dollar amounts. The handwriting was scrawled, but the entries were clear. This was a record of transactions. "Looks like someone's been keeping track of their dirty money," Taylor muttered, his eyes scanning the page. Jordan nodded, her jaw tightening. "This is more than just Carter's patrol logs. This is organized." She opened the laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The screen lit up, displaying a login screen. She cursed under her breath. Without the password, accessing the files would be impossible. "Let's bag this and take it back to the precinct," she said. "If there's anything incriminating on here, we'll find it." Taylor nodded, pulling an evidence bag from his pocket. As he slipped the laptop inside, a noise from the far end of the warehouse made them both freeze. Footsteps. Jordan extinguished her flashlight, motioning for Taylor to do the same. They moved quickly but quietly, positioning themselves behind a stack of crates. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by low voices. "Check the table," one voice said. It was gruff, unfamiliar. "They said the pickup was tonight," another voice replied. "If someone's been here, we need to know." Jordan's pulse quickened. She exchanged a glance with Taylor, who mouthed, "What now?" Jordan gestured for him to stay put. She carefully peeked around the edge of the crate, her eyes locking onto two men moving toward the table. Neither was in uniform, but their demeanor and movements suggested they weren't amateurs. One of the men stopped suddenly, his gaze sweeping the room. "Something's off," he muttered. "The laptop's gone." "Let's get out of here," the other replied, his voice tense. "We'll report back and regroup." As the men retreated toward the exit, Jordan and Taylor remained frozen, waiting until the sound of their footsteps faded completely. "That was close," Taylor whispered, his voice barely audible. Jordan nodded, her mind racing. "We need to move. If they know we've been here, they'll start covering their tracks." They slipped out of the warehouse and returned to the car, their movements swift and purposeful. As Taylor started the engine, Jordan pulled out her phone and called Captain Rogers. "Rogers," he answered groggily. "It's late, Lieutenant. What's going on?" "We've got a problem, Captain," Jordan said, her tone urgent. "Carter's patrol logs led us to the Grayson warehouse. We found evidence of organized activity, ledgers, possibly money laundering. And we weren't the only ones there." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Rogers spoke again, his voice tight. "Get back to the precinct. I'll meet you there." Back at the precinct, Jordan and Taylor secured the evidence in the evidence locker and briefed Rogers on what they'd found. The captain's expression grew darker with every word, his frustration evident. "This is bigger than I thought," he admitted. "If Carter's involved, we need to act fast. But we have to handle this carefully. If word gets out, whoever he's working with will disappear." Jordan nodded. "Agreed. We need to question Carter, but we can't let him know we're onto him." "Not yet." Rogers sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'll authorize an internal investigation. But Matthews, you'd better be ready for what comes next. If Carter's involved, this could shake the entire precinct." Jordan met his gaze, her resolve unshakable. "I'm ready, Captain. Whatever it takes." As she left Rogers' office, Jordan felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She knew this wasn't just about Carter anymore. This was about uncovering a web of corruption that had been allowed to fester. And she was determined to tear it down, no matter the cost. The reckoning. The sun was barely rising when Lieutenant Jordan Matthews sat in her office, reviewing the evidence collected from the Grayson warehouse the night before. The laptop, now in the hands of the precinct's tech team, had been decrypted overnight, and the initial findings were chilling. Transaction logs, coded communications, and the names of several individuals, including Officer Blake Carter, were all laid bare in black and white. This wasn't just about Carter's defiance or negligence. This was organized corruption, and it had infiltrated the heart of the precinct. Captain Rogers entered the office quietly, his face etched with the weight of what they'd uncovered. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Jordan, setting a freshly printed report on her desk. "This just came in from the tech team," Rogers said, his voice low. "Carter's name is all over the financial records. He's been funneling money through the warehouse for months. Kickbacks, payoffs, the works. And worse, he's not the only one." Jordan picked up the report, her eyes scanning the names. Several were unfamiliar, but a few stood out. Officers she'd seen in the precinct, men and women she'd passed in the hallways. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just Carter's doing. He was part of a larger network, one that had thrived in the shadows for far too long. "How deep does this go?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Rogers sighed, leaning forward. "Deep enough that if we don't handle this carefully, it could bring the entire precinct down. The chief is already aware, and internal affairs will be here by the end of the day." Jordan set the report down, her gaze meeting Rogers. "What about Carter? Does he know we're onto him?" "Not yet," Rogers replied. "But he's smart. He'll figure it out soon enough." Jordan nodded, her mind racing. "We need to bring him in before he has a chance to run. If he's the key to this, we can't risk losing him." Rogers hesitated, then nodded. "Agreed. I'll authorize the arrest." An hour later, the precinct was buzzing with quiet tension. Jordan had called a meeting with a small, trusted team of officers to brief them on the operation. Sergeant Ben Taylor stood by her side, his presence a reassuring constant as they laid out the plan. "We have reason to believe Officer Carter is involved in illegal activity tied to the Grayson warehouse," Jordan began, her voice steady and authoritative. "Our objective is to bring him in for questioning without alerting anyone else who might be involved. This has to be clean and contained. No mistakes." The officers nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. Taylor stepped forward, addressing the team. "Carter's on patrol this morning, and his route takes him near the east side of town. We'll intercept him there and bring him in quietly. Lieutenant Matthews and I will lead the team." As the officers dispersed to prepare, Jordan felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Taylor, his expression serious but supportive. "You sure about this?" he asked. "Carter's not going to come quietly." Jordan nodded. "I'm sure. If we let this slide, we're no better than the people we're trying to stop." Taylor gave her a small nod. "Let's get it done." The team moved swiftly, coordinating their positions as Carter's patrol car appeared on the east side of town. Jordan and Taylor, stationed in an unmarked vehicle, watched as he stopped at a quiet intersection, seemingly oblivious to the operation unfolding around him. "Now," Jordan said into her radio, her voice calm but firm. Two marked patrol cars pulled up, blocking Carter's vehicle from the front and rear. Jordan and Taylor exited their car, approaching cautiously as Carter stepped out of his vehicle, his expression a mix of confusion and anger. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his hand hovering near his holster. "Officer Carter," Jordan said, her voice steady, "you're under arrest for suspicion of involvement in illegal activities, including money laundering and misconduct. Place your hands where we can see them." Carter's eyes narrowed, his defiance flaring. "You've got nothing on me." "We have enough," Jordan replied. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." For a moment, it seemed like Carter might resist. His hand inched closer to his holster, his jaw tightening. But the sight of the other officers, their weapons at the ready, made him hesitate. Slowly, he raised his hands, his glare locked on Jordan. "This isn't over," he snarled as Taylor moved in to cuff him. "You think you've won, but you don't know how deep this goes." Jordan didn't respond, her expression unreadable. She knew Carter was trying to rattle her, but his words only strengthened her resolve. Back at the precinct, Carter was placed in an interrogation room, his defiance replaced by a simmering silence. Jordan watched him through the observation window, her mind racing with the implications of his arrest. If Carter was willing to hint at the depth of the corruption, it meant he believed he had leverage, and that made him dangerous. Captain Rogers joined her at the window, his arms crossed. "He's not going to talk easily." "He will," Jordan replied. "Everyone has a breaking point." She entered the interrogation room, her expression calm but unyielding. Carter sat across the table, his cuffed hands resting on the metal surface. He smirked as she took a seat. "Lieutenant Matthews," he drawled, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Jordan didn't rise to the bait. "We know about the warehouse, Carter. We know about the money, the ledgers, and your connections to the operation. If you cooperate, it could work in your favor." Carter leaned back, his smirk widening. "You think I'm scared of you. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Enlighten me," Jordan replied, her tone steady. Carter's smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "You think I'm the only one. This goes higher than you can imagine. You take me down, and you'll have a lot more enemies than you bargained for." Jordan leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "If you think threats are going to save you, you're mistaken. This isn't about you anymore, Carter. It's about justice, and if you're not willing to cooperate, we'll take down every single person involved, one by one." For the first time, Carter's confidence wavered. He shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing. "You're playing a dangerous game, Lieutenant." "So are you," Jordan countered. "But the difference is, I'm not afraid to lose." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with tension. Finally, Carter leaned forward, his voice low. "Fine. You want names. I'll give you names. But if I go down, I'm taking everyone with me." Jordan's heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. "Start talking." The confession that followed was explosive. Carter detailed the network of corruption that had infiltrated the precinct, naming names and revealing the extent of their activities. It wasn't just about money laundering. It was about systemic abuse of power, with officers turning a blind eye to crimes in exchange for kickbacks. By the time Carter finished, Jordan felt both vindicated and exhausted. The fight was far from over. But this was a turning point, a chance to rebuild the integrity of the precinct and hold those responsible accountable. As she stepped out of the interrogation room, Captain Rogers met her gaze, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "You did it," he said. Jordan shook her head. "This is just the beginning. We've got a lot of work to do." And as she walked back to her office, Jordan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. Because for her, justice wasn't just a job, it was a calling. And she wouldn't stop until the precinct was a place where the badge truly meant something.